afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrea Grant, and I'm a graduate of the College of Arts and Sciences and the School of Law. I'm a trustee of the university, and I am a member of the Washington-Baltimore Regional Cabinet. Now, for those of you who don't know what the Cabinet is, we are a group of supporters of the university who work together to advance the mission of the university through various events similar to this tonight. And we are trying always to engage and keep everyone informed in the Washington community about all that is going on in Washington, St. Louis, and the world. And we really try to reach everyone. More than 16,000 parents, alums, friends of the university have been in our preview, and we are always hoping that everyone will stay informed and engaged. Now, we usually like to have these events in person, but unfortunately, we can't do that at this time. So we are using the Zoom format to bring you a very important and interesting and very timely salon this time, reporting politics in the nation's capital. We have a very impressive panel, and we will meet them in just a few minutes. Before that, however, I'd like to take a moment and acknowledge the passing of a very important member of the Washington University community. That is the passing of Chancellor Emeritus William Danforth. As many of you may know, the Chancellor died on September 16th at the age of 94. Now, Dr. Danforth served Washington University for more than 65 years, and 25 of those years he served as Chancellor. Now, anyone who knew Bill Danforth knew that he was an extremely special individual. He cared deeply about the university and all those who were affiliated with it. There will be a virtual celebration of Dr. Danforth's life tomorrow, October 21 at 7 o'clock Central Time, 8 o'clock Eastern Time. Anyone who would like to give a gift in memory of the Chancellor, please give that gift to the Danforth Scholars Program. I would like to just take a moment now and ask everyone for a moment of silence to honor Bill Danforth. Thank you very much. Now, before we get started with our panel, I just want to say a word or two about what's going on in St. Louis and what has happened over the summer here. The fall semester is moving in full steam ahead, perfectly underway. There are very strict safety measures in place on the campus, and the whole system seems to be working very efficiently. Now, despite the COVID pandemic, admissions were very strong this year, as strong as they almost are each year, and the class for 2024 is about the same size as all of its predecessor classes. There are about 1,800 students in the freshman class, and 85 of them are from the Washington-Baltimore region. Now, as I said, the cabinet, the Washington-Baltimore Regional Cabinet, tries very hard to make sure that alumni, parents, and friends of the university are connected at all times. And over the summer, the cabinet hosted a very interesting salon, The Economic Impact Caused by the Global Pandemic. And this fall, the Defense, Aerospace, and National Security Network is going to hold a series of events, and you will hear more about that. Now, as I said, I'm sure everyone here is used to the Zoom format. We will have about 30 minutes of presentation and about 30 minutes of Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, we would love you to participate. Please type that question for us. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now, it is with great pleasure I'd like to introduce our moderator, Laura Meckler. Laura is the national education reporter for the Washington Post, and she covers national trends, federal policy, and the Department of Education. Prior to joining the Post, she worked for 13 years with the Wall Street Journal, where she covered presidential politics, the White House, healthcare, and immigration. Laura is a graduate of Washington University, and she sits on the board that oversees our student newspaper, Student Life. I'm sure you have all enjoyed that. Laura received in 2003 to 2004, she was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University. And in 1999, she received the Livingston Award for National Reporting. And I also want to say that I very much appreciate Laura was so kind and moderated a panel similar to this one this evening in 2014, and now she is helping us once again. So thank you, Laura. Now, tonight's panelists are going to talk about how reporting is handled when they address politics in this very complex and challenging world that we face, and the specific challenges that journalists encounter and how they deal with them. So Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I'm really excited to be here virtually, and it's certainly my privilege to be introducing this incredible panel that we have here of WashU alumni. And I'm happy to say that I actually know each of them independent of this panel. I've gotten to know each of them in different capacities, and it's just really first-rate set of people. So we'll start with Mary Bruce, who covers the 2020 presidential election and major political stories for all of ABC News platforms, including the recent national conventions and Democratic primaries. Her work can be seen daily on Good Morning America, Nightline, and ABC's radio, digital, and streaming programs. And I'm here to say that I met her when she was a reporter for Student Life, and she was excellent back then as well. So no surprise to me that she is where she is now. Mike Isikoff is an award-winning journalist and best-selling author who joined Yahoo News in 2014 as a chief investigative correspondent. In 2009, he was named one of the 50 best and most influential journalists in the nation's capital by Washington Magazine. And he's also a great dad and a neighbor of mine. Claude R. Marx, who I met soon after I got to Washington many, many years ago, is also an award-winning journalist and a reporter for FTC Watch, a publication of LexisNexis, where he writes about regulatory agencies. Claude has had extensive experience in the field, including working as a reporter and a political correspondent for the Associated Press. We overlap there a bit, the Credit Union Times, and the Arkansas Democrat. And last but not least, Eric Schultz is now a senior advisor to former President Obama. He served in the White House as principal deputy press secretary, which is the number two person right behind the press secretary, and a special assistant to the president. He was recognized by Politico as the strategist, quote, White House officials turn to in a crisis. And, you know, looking back on it, it hardly seems like there were any crises at all, comparatively speaking. So he was really kind of bored. But anyway, he found a way to fill his time. He spoke on behalf of the administration on Air Force One and in the White House briefing room. I covered the White House when he was in these jobs, and he's always a straight shooter, which is really the highest praise that reporters have to give to people in jobs like this. Panelists, I'd like to thank all of you for taking time to join me today discussing reporting politics in Washington today. So let's get started. I have some questions to get our discussion going, but I really want to leave lots of time for your questions, which you should put into the Q&A, and they will be fed over to me. We will make lots of time for them. But let's just start out setting the table. You know, we're at this, you know, incredible moment in the Trump presidency, just 2 weeks. Is that right? Just exactly 2 weeks until the election. I think it's seems like both a lifetime away and also like it will never arrive. And yet we are almost here. And so we are going to be moving into a new era one way or another in Washington. Things will be different. And I'd like each of you, and I'll start with Mary, I'd like each of you to just tell me something that you're going to be looking for, either in these closing days of the campaign, election night, or in the immediate aftermath, something that as sort of a smart person that you are observing Washington, that you think might tell you something about what's coming. So Mary, what are you going to be looking for? What should our listeners be looking for?
I think, you know, as someone who covers the campaigns, but also covers the Hill, I'm always fascinated and have been for the last several years at how, you know, what is happening down ballot, and also how this party is reacting to the president, how the Republican Party is reacting to the president. And I think you have started to see an interesting shift in the last week or two, fidelity to the president is valued above all else in this Republican Party. And all of a sudden, there's some putting a little bit of daylight, which is often a sign that they are concerned that the president is in real trouble. I think, we all saw Ben Sass, of course, after he won his primary, coming out in that phone call with constituents last week and really ripping into the president. But you've also seen some who are in some really tight races. Martha McSally, who a couple weeks ago, time sort of stands still, was asked point blank at a debate, was she proud of her work with the president? And she refused to give an answer. So I think, as I head into Election Day, while so much is focused on what's happening at the top of the ticket, I often think what's most fascinating is what is happening in the state races. I think North Carolina is a fascinating example, looking at what's happening with Tillis there in a state that is so critical. And also, I think those down ballot races are such an interesting indication of where the broader state is at as we head into this. So I think if I'm reading tea leaves for the next 14 days, those are just some trends that are starting to peak up that I think are really fascinating as you try and get a sense of what on earth is going to happen on November 3rd and in the days after.
And do you think that in the period after the election, if Trump were to lose, do you think that we're going to see the party sort of run Trump who, we never heard of the guy? Or do you think that the influence on the party is permanent and you're still going to have a large chunk of the Republican Party in bed with the ideas and the philosophy and the approach he's taken?
Well, I think the Republican Party right now is the president's party, especially on the Hill, at least in that sense. So I think you will certainly see some perhaps try to, if the president loses and if there is, a very sort of definitive loss, it will be very interesting to see who tries to distance themselves, how they try to distance themselves. But there's too much tape out there. I think for everyone to suddenly turn around and say, oh, I played no role in that. And I think everyone knows, you're bracing for, I think, there's a real challenge in the Republican Party and what their future looks like. I think a couple weeks ago, I was interviewing the Lincoln Group, and I'm sure you guys are all familiar with them. But for those who may not know them as well, they are the Republicans who are out there running those ads that are just trolling the president. And I asked, one of their founders, like, well, what's really the goal here? If you win, all of a sudden you're Republicans who are trying to have a seat at the table in a Biden administration. What would that look like as a Republican who's actively trying to get Joe Biden elected? And they're blunt in saying that their goal as Republicans is to wipe out Trumpism and reclaim their party. And if there are other Republicans who I know feel that way, it will be one wild ride, I think, to watch what that looks like over the next several years, because I don't think that's an overnight process.
Yeah, totally agree. Mike, do you want to you can either pick up and add to what Mary just talked about, or pick something completely different that you're going to be looking for?
Yeah, no, I'm kind of focused on what happens after the election. Assuming we know a winner relatively soon, which is not at all clear, but if we do, there's, the point you were raising, Laura, like how quickly do Republicans just, walk away from Donald Trump and pretend he never happened. And, I suspect there will be a lot of that. If he gets soundly defeated, as the polls indicate he's going to, it may be that a year or 2 years from now, his name is never uttered by any Republican senators or members of Congress. Looking at all this as a sort of, long national nightmare, could well be the way this plays out. But also, let's remember, if he loses, he's still president for another 2.5 months, right? And there's a lot he can do during that period, from pardons to all sorts of executive orders to firing people left and right, to releasing all sorts of material. So I think that the capacity for great deals, a great amount of controversy and clashes and challenges to our constitutional norms could well be in store after the election. Now, all that is predicated on him losing soundly. If it's close, we're in for, quite quite a stormy few months there. I assume that we're going to have litigation up the wazoo that will make Bush versus Gore. This will be Bush versus Gore on steroids, and it could well end up in the Supreme Court. But that's if it's a close election. So those are the two things that I'll be focused on.
Have you considered or looked at the question of whether theoretically the president could pardon himself?
That is a open question for which there is no constitutional precedent that anybody could point to. I thought it was interesting during the Amy Coney Barrett hearings, she was asked that question and she ducked it, as she ducked almost all other substantive questions. But I think it's completely an open one. And there will, if he does, there will undoubtedly be challenges that end up to the Supreme Court, and that could be quite a Supreme Court case.
Claude, what are you going to be looking for in the next couple weeks? Oh, you're muted, Claude. If you could unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. Okay, I'm gonna look at the other guy in the race, Joe Biden. Let's assume for a second that Biden wins, which the polls indicate that he will. He is basically run as kind of the anti-Trump, and so I think initially we want to look at a couple of things. First of all, who he picks as a cabinet. Does he do a very diverse cabinet? Does he do a Treasury Secretary who's not from Wall Street, for example? That would be a very interesting pick. And also, how does he handle Congress? I mean, the relations with President Trump and Congress, shall we say, have been a little on the chilly side, to put it mildly, on a lot of issues. And Biden is, of course, a creature of the Senate, a real institutionalist. Now, so the question becomes, if the Democrats gain control of the Senate, they will have 53, 54 votes or so, but for a lot of stuff, they'll need 60 votes. So will the Republicans play ball at all, or will they be total obstructionists the way they did under the first 2 years of Obama when you had the same party breakdown? So that's one thing that's something that will be very interesting to look at. And I think nobody really knows what's going on. And once January 20th rolls around, is he gonna run as kind of a moderate liberal the way he's been, or does he run, or does the fact that the more enthusiasm in the party has been from the left, how far left will they push him on things, whether that's court packing or whether it's on revamping the filibuster or more policy stuff, the Green New Deal. Those are all things that would be very interesting to see if Biden should win.
Those are all really good questions. Eric, I'm gonna let you choose your own thing, but I also would love for you to pick up on something Claude said, which is, President Obama was elected on a promise of bringing the country together, and there's no red states and blue states. We're all the United States, and of course that didn't really go so well. And now we have Biden, who's running on a not exactly the same, but a similar note, which is that we can have unity again. Do you think that he'll be able to do that, pull that off, given the moment we're in Washington, if he were elected?
Yeah, I guess I'm with Mary on this. I think there's too much tape, as she said, that it's going to be hard for Republicans to sort of walk back their allegiance, not only to President Trump, but his sort of brand of politics, right? This isn't something where there are Republicans in the House or the Senate who have strong records of sort of standing up for sort of the institutions that Trump has spent the last 4 years sabotaging: freedom of the press, respect for the rule of law. The sort of natural normative boundaries that have sort of governed our politics for many decades. So I hope that November 3rd is a good night for Democrats. I'm hopeful that Vice President Biden and Senator Harris will be victorious. I am looking at the Senate. I think that if Democrats can take control of the Senate, that tells us two things. One, that means the victories that we had on election night were not just in blue states. It wasn't just an avalanche of sort of Democratic progressive support. That means we will have won in purple and red states. And that means that Joe Biden will be coming to Washington with more of a mandate to govern. And it also tells us that he will have more willing partners in Congress. I think by all accounts, we expect the House to stay Democratic. But if he has both chambers, I think that's going to give him a pretty big running start in terms of getting down to business. And we all know how much work there is to do. The only other piece I'd add is, in terms of down ballot, I'm also looking very down ballot. As you all know, sort of every 10 years, the census drives the redistricting process of how congressional, state legislative and congressional districts are drawn on the map. And in 2010, when Democrats got routed, Republicans sort of maximized those wins from the 2010 midterms and sort of redesigned a lot of congressional maps districts to their advantage. And I think that Democrats sort of spent the last 10 years early on moping, but then getting to work to make sure that the process doesn't repeat itself. So we have a real strong chance of flipping some state legislative chambers in states like Texas, Arizona, North Carolina, Iowa, Pennsylvania. So I think that when we're talking about not only sort of the wins for this particular moment, which I agree could not be more important, but there are certain races that actually will affect how Congress runs for decades to come.
Hey, Laura, can I just pick up on the too much tape point that both Mary and Eric made, by which I assume they meant that there's too much tape of Republican members of Congress, senators, talking up their allegiance to Trump and Trumpism, that it would be difficult for them to just walk away from that. And all I can think of is the tape of Lindsey Graham saying twice on tape, there's no way I will support rushing a Supreme Court nominee through in the last days of the 2020 election. And you can mark my words here. He said it as clearly as he could. And that was not too much tape for him doing precisely what he said he wasn't going to do. So I'm not sure the too much tape argument is going to go all that far.
I think, in fact, he actually said, hold the tape.
Hold the tape.
Hold
Right.
it. He asked us to bring back the tape. But I think the difference is whether, if Trump is not reelected, can you get away with contradicting your tape in the way that you can now in the Trump era?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. Does somebody like Lindsey Graham turn back into the Lindsey Graham of old if he's reelected and Biden is elected? Is he now suddenly the bipartisan deal maker again? Or does all that tape follow him with Democrats, not willing to be in the same room?
I think the Democrats would be willing to be in the same room if they think they could cut a deal. But I think more probably the thing with the one I think you should keep in mind about Trump is that Trump did a hostile takeover of the Republican Party in one respect, but in a lot of ways the intra battles within the party sort of made the table for him. So some of those will still be in place. For example, the people who didn't like the sort of more accommodationist approach that Boehner and Paul Ryan did within the House or so, that's clearly a factor that's going to be the case regardless. So I don't see the Republican Party going back to pre-Trump. I think the post-Trump may look Trump light, if you will, but there will still be things such as I don't see them going backward on things like trade and other stuff, where Trump has clearly changed the dynamic.
Michael, I agree with you. I think that I don't underestimate Republicans' ability to be completely shameless. I think that's their greatest strength. But my point is, I think the energy we have seen in the electorate from January of 2017, hopefully until November 3rd, shows that sort of Trump poked the bear, and Republicans use that time to make their bed. That we have enough sort of memory, and the electorate, I think, is plugged in enough to know sort of where the two parties stand right now. And that's, if you just quite simply look at the candidates for president of the United States on both sides, look at our Senate candidates, look at their Senate candidates and what they're talking about, their records. And I think that is a branding exercise that we have gone through for the last 4 years. And I actually think the electorate, is pretty plugged in to sort of to that difference.
Following up on that, then how would a President Biden if we were to get one, deal with that. I mean, he really has spent the last year plus saying that, he is subscribes to a different kind of politics and he's going to bring that back. Can he do that?
Well, I think one thing to watch for is another thing to watch for after the election, assuming there's a Biden presidency, is what he does and what a Democratic Senate does on eliminating the filibuster and expanding the court. I think Biden's instinct is not to do either. He's been opposed over the course of his long career to both such moves. But, and this is a big but, if a Supreme Court with Amy Coney Barrett on it overturns the ACA, and if it in some way rules on the election in a way, I mean, presumably if it ruled in favor of Trump, Biden wouldn't be president. But I think there's a lot of pent up anger already among Democrats, progressive Democrats in particular. But if they overturn the Affordable Care Act, I think that will ramp up the anger and the pressure on a President Biden and a Democratic Senate to take those moves. And that could be one of the sort of big battles of 2021.
Although I would just add to that, they might have an easier fix for the Affordable Care Act. They could do legislative fixes that would shore it up and make it stronger to withstand a judicial appeal. So that's probably I'm not saying that's not possible that the court couldn't still overturn it, but it would be easier if the tax is reimposed, for instance, or what have you. Okay, we could probably stay on these. Yeah, someone else want to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to jump in quickly and say I also don't know that Biden is going to waste. He will have a limited amount of capital when he takes office in January, assuming that he wins. I don't know that he will waste capital on the filibuster and the court packing right away. I mean, I think those will be secondary. He will want to do more economic stimulus, I suspect, maybe Green New Deal or some variation thereof of that.
But on the other hand, let me just push back on that a little bit. I think that it would be, if he's going to do something big like that, he probably does need to do it at the beginning. Like, you have a window where you can get big things done, and it would probably be harder. Eric, do you have a thought about that?
Yeah, I do think this will be a challenge. There's just, I mean, what a President-elect Biden would be walking into is massively more complicated and harder than even what Barack Obama was elected to in 2008 and 9. And so the problems that he faces are massive and large and super complicated. And so I do think they're going to have to prioritize. You can't do everything, and you can't do everything right away. And I think I agree with all of you that sort of Biden has sort of institutionalist inclinations, that he's not a upset the apple cart and flamethrowing kind of guy. And so I think he will try and get done as much as he can get done through sort of the sort of institutional norms and sort of routine ways that Washington used to work before this current administration.
Yeah.
I'm gonna shift gear so we can cover a few other topics before we turn to questions. Mary, I'm gonna direct this at you. Again, we'll have you kick this off, which is about, here we are living in this COVID era, which is something that, we, none of us have ever lived through a pandemic before. And as reporters, it just really changes how we have to operate. And I wonder, especially a job like yours, which relies, so much on being out and talking with people. You can't just call up random voters on the phone very easily. How has COVID changed your reporting?
It is incredibly frustrating. I think, like I'm sure all of you feel, it's very hard to cover something and not actually be there. It's you know, the producer that I work with, we laugh at ourselves at how excited we get to go to Delaware for these like funny, small little press briefings that Joe Biden does, where we all sit in our designated circles, just because it's like we're getting out on the trail, if you can even call it that. But, you know, especially in a campaign year, you know, I was expecting to be living out of a suitcase and to be going to multiple campaign events a day. And that's, you know, what I love most about covering campaigns is that you get to see the country, you get to interact with Americans, you get to get a real sense of what people are looking for out of Washington. And, you know, people criticize us reporters for being too much in the DC bubble. Well, that's how we burst the bubble. And it's very hard to do that when, you know, we're all stuck in our respective basements and covering candidates who are in their basements. I think it also is concerning because even though it's not by no means scientific, you get a real read on what voters want and what voters think. I think, you know, all of us, you probably, you know, everyone remembers their first Trump rally. And I think you remember what it was like to go there and to say, wow, this is really, there's something going on here, right? Like there's a movement, there's a lot of power and enthusiasm here. When his campaign was sort of first taking off and realizing, wait a second, we should really be taking this seriously. You get that sense by going somewhere. And it is a little frightening at times to think that our best sense in some ways of the electorate is polls and Twitter. And that, you know, you're not out there talking to your Uber driver and, you know, the person you run into at the coffee shop in some small town in Ohio. So it's hard to get a read on things. You know, we're doing the best we can, but it, you know, to your point, it's hard to cold call, you know, random voters in swing states when you would normally just be running into them.
And anyone else have a thought on that?
Well,
Yeah.
for the record, I'm not in my basement, I'm in my attic. That's where I spend all my time these days. But it does, you know, I do remember 4 years ago, almost exactly, flying out to St. Louis for the WashU debate between Trump and Hillary Clinton. And I don't know if it was an Uber driver or the taxi driver I had from the airport to WashU, a woman who started telling me about all the people Hillary Clinton had murdered over the course of her career, and probing her a little. She said she knew that because her husband had told her and he saw it on the internet. And it was you know, an interesting clue that I probably should have paid more attention to at the time. But you know, that's the kind of interaction that is helpful that we're not having right now because we're all stuck in our homes.
Yeah. All right, let's if there are other questions about that from the audience, feel free to ask it in the Q&A and we can pursue that more. I want to change the subject a little bit and ask something that I think personally is, I find, among the most troubling things in recent years. And that is this, within the nation, it feels like we have a real fundamental divide between whether people accept what the news media, the mainstream news media is telling them is truth to the best that we can ascertain it, and those who really do believe it's all fake news. And this is not a small number of people who think this. And I'm wondering for the panel's thoughts on whether that's sort of here to stay. You know, are we going to be living with this, you know, for the foreseeable future, where there is just not just a difference of opinion, but literally a difference of facts? And you know, what can be done to confront this? Who wants to try this first? All right, Claude, why don't you jump in?
I fear that you are correct that we may be living this for a while, partially because people are so segmented in terms of their sources of information that they often get alternative facts. I mean, you have people in the White House talking about alternative facts, but it brings to mind the line that the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan said: "Everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts." And I think that a lot of news organizations, yours, for example, does a really good job with the fact checkers to sort of help people navigate what's true. Because a lot of times too, it's not always a clear cut. It's not necessarily true or false. I mean, sometimes people will say things that are partially true, but they're misleading. So you have to be careful about that as well. but I fear we may be with that for a while. And I think it's incumbent upon journalists. That's where we can do the most good in sort of helping people ferret out what's accurate and what's not accurate.
Yeah, it feels to me like misleading is something we've been dealing with for a long time. I mean, people have been misleading probably since the beginning of the Republic, but the idea of actual straight up, you know, disagreement on what basic truth is. Anyone else want to weigh in on that question?
Yeah, I agree with you, Laura, that this is sort of one of the big fundamental problems we face right now. That if, like you all have said, if happen to have a good, earnest, good faith debate on various topics, but if we can't agree that I'm sitting at a table right now, and that is a problem. If someone thinks I'm sitting at an elephant or whatever, a rainbow and not a table, that's a huge problem. And I agree that the Post and all of your outlets do good fact checking. If I'm going to be critical, which I will be, it feels a little antiquated. You know, was it Churchill who said, you know, by the time a lie travels around the world, the truth isn't catching up, or I'm sorry to butcher the quote, but it just feels like there's an avalanche of misinformation. And then yes, sort of a fact checker pops up, sort of correcting it, you know, a day or two later on his or her column. But I do think the media is going to start to have to sort of be more aggressive in terms of maybe more discerning about the information that is flowing back and forth. And I also think, I was speaking a couple months ago to a group of social studies teachers in upstate New York, and this was brought up, and you know, they asked me for advice, and I sort of turned it back on them. I said, I feel like media literacy has to be a really deliberate, purposeful sort of curriculum that needs to be built out. It's it should be, you know, I don't know if it's there's components of this at WashU, but starting very young, I feel like we need to educate young people in terms of how they're getting their information, how to decipher sort of the avalanche of materials that they're inundated with on a minute by minute basis. As you said, that you know, we live in these information silos, and if we don't start to help people understand how to navigate that, I think this is only going to get worse.
And I think so much of this quickly becomes a conversation, and I'm sure all of us I know have engaged in this for many years, is, you know, what is the future of social media? How does that impact everything that we do? Because I think, Eric, we all share your frustration. I think it, you know, facing this, what often feels like just a fire hose of misinformation, and what do you choose to tackle? What do you not? What do you let, you know, just kind of go by the wayside, and what do you tackle head on? It becomes more complicated, obviously, when you're in a situation where oftentimes that misinformation is being spread around by people in very high positions. But I don't see, you know, as much as I wish people were sitting down at 6:30 and watching the evening news, that's not going to happen anytime soon. And so how do you, you know, get people out of their own echo chambers, to your point? But you know, it becomes a bigger conversation about the future of social media. And I just don't, you know, when everyone can go and just hear people who agree with them, it's a very daunting task.
I just want to weigh in a little bit on the subject of tone, because I think tone and approach is really important here. One of the sort of unfortunate aspects of the Trump era is, because he says so many preposterous things that are not true and are disprovable, that there's been a tendency on, you know, the part of mainstream media to sort of, you know, rebut him at every turn. And that's mostly worthy of doing. But there's a point at which, you know, we become, and this is particularly true on cable, and, you know, CNN leaps out to me as the biggest offender of just becoming the anti-Trump news organization. We're going to spend all our time telling you what a big fat liar Donald Trump is. And I think that's a real trap. You fall into, you know, what Donald Trump wants to paint you as, the opposition party, and you're tuned out. You tune out all those who are on Trump's side, or maybe in the middle, or maybe not sure, because, you know, you come off as you're just there to rebut the president. And it'll be interesting to see how this plays out after the election. But I think, and again, we have nobody from CNN here, but I think CNN has done itself enormous damage because it's completely fallen into that trap. Its coverage is not, its chyrons are Trump lied again, Trump did this, and the tone is all wrong. We got to be aggressive about challenging inaccuracies, but we ought to be dispassionate about it. We can't fall into the trap that a lot of news organizations have fallen into.
I'm going to move to audience questions in a moment. And there are some people who have made the question, want to talk about what would happen if Trump is reelected, which I think is an important point. This election is not over by any means. But I do want to ask one other question about if Trump is defeated, which is, we're talking about a post-Trump era, but does anyone think there's a good chance that he doesn't go away? He's has his own radio talk show or his own podcast or even his own Fox News show. And maybe he teases that he's going to run again in 2024. And so people need to listen. And he's just still part of the conversation on a daily basis. What happens then?
I think he will have, if he is defeated, I think he will have a very hard time letting go of the microphone and the megaphone. And above all else, he is the producer in chief. He understands television better than anyone and how to manipulate the medium. So I would not be surprised at all if you saw a Trump news network at all, or if he found a way to stay in the conversation, for sure.
Yeah.
But that'll be a big challenge, though, for the news media. Like, how much today you kind of have to listen to most of what he says. He's the president. How much do we have to listen to him then?
Yeah, I would agree. But also, I think the Republican Party will be torn because he will certainly be the 900-pound gorilla within the GOP. But they also will want to find a way to move beyond that. You've already got 4 or 5 Republican senators who are positioning themselves to run for president in 4 years. Should President Trump, lose? And so it'll be interesting to see how they balance. Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Josh Hawley, all come to Mount and all want to be president. So,
all right. Okay, I'm going to turn to questions, and we have about 20 minutes left. I'm going to try to get through as many as we can. So maybe we'll try to give some tight answers to these. Maybe not everyone won't weigh on in each one. All right, this was from Amanda Dorison, who graduated in 2005. She says, what if the polls happen to be wrong and Trump wins again? What is the world going to look like? What can we do? Will there even be a free press? Who would like to take that? Mary, how about you?
If Trump wins, I think he will be more emboldened than we have seen so far. I think so much also depends on the balance of power in Washington, right? So if say things stay the same, I think the first term will look light compared to what you'll see in a second term. I think he will be emboldened. I think he will feel he has, a huge, mandate and can do what he wants. In terms of will there be a free press? All of us will continue doing our jobs, but I think the attacks on us as the enemy of the people will be ratcheted up. I think to the earlier question about how do you, maintain some loyalty to fact and truth, that will be tested even more in an environment where I think, we think that the media is polarized now. Your comments about CNN versus what you see on Fox, I think that divide will only grow. And I think we will all be very, very tired, is what I will say.
All right, I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Jaden Sattenstein, who is, I happen to know, a current student lifer and current student at the university. In light of President Trump's recent COVID case, how should journalists be reporting on politicians' health? What is public interest and what should be kept private? Mike, do you want to take that?
Well, look, when it's the president of the United States, I think everything should be reported about the president's health. It's about the president's health is key to him functioning as the chief executive in our government. And if he's not able to do so, and let's not forget, we have a long history of White Houses covering up illnesses and diseases and disabilities of our presidents. And this is a bipartisan phenomenon. But when you have this particular White House that is prone to, distort reality to the maximum extent, I think it's even more important for us to try to learn as much as we can. I just want to pick up on one more point about if Trump is reelected. I echo everything that Mary was saying, but I just want to add one more. The politicization of law enforcement and the intelligence community is the thing that I think would be, among the greater dangers of a second Trump term. I mean, even as we speak, over the last couple of days, he's demanding that William Barr open up investigations and appoint a special counsel into, the Hunter Biden emails and related matters. And, he's doing precisely what he accused the Obama folks of doing to him, weaponizing law enforcement for political purposes. Here, he's just doing it openly. And if he gets a second term, I think there'll be no restricting of him, no restrictions on him doing that even more if he's reelected.
All right, next question goes back to the prospect of a Biden presidency. The questioner wants to hear our thoughts on reports that his transition team is vetting some Republicans, such as Jeff Flake or John Kasich, for potential cabinet positions. Is that a good, wise political move, or more likely to stall progressive policies and potentially anger Democratic voters? I think this goes back to something we were discussing before, which is the balance that if Biden wins, that he's going to have to strike between his instincts, which are towards reaching out, and the anger and passion on the left. Eric or Claude?
Okay, I think he will. I think there's a good chance Biden will pick a Republican for the cabinet because while he was in the Senate, he worked in a very bipartisan way on a lot of issues, and I think there's a tradition. President Obama, of course, picked a couple of Republicans for his cabinets, and I think it's not unusual. It's not, and former President Clinton did as well. So though he would be continuing a long tradition of recent Democrats, actually President Bush did it as well. I think it would be a good move. And all the people you mentioned are solid. They're all solid Republicans, but they are never Trumpers, and that would sort of would I think make them somewhat more palatable to Democrats who might be leery.
Eric, do you think that would go over all right?
Yeah, I would be surprised if the vice president doesn't have Republicans in his cabinet. He's pledged to make sure his cabinet looks like the rest of the country. And we have to admit that Republicans are, there's a lot of them in this country. And so they should be represented in Washington too. So I'd be very surprised if the cabinet doesn't represent the sort of demographic diversity of the country, but also the sort of ideological diversity of the country too.
Well, I'm going to pick up with another question and take that another step further in terms of outreach. Eric, why don't you take this also, which is thoughts about Dianne Feinstein and her hug with Graham after the Senate hearings. This questioner wants, so Cynthia Wagner wants to know if there's any talk of her leaving before she finishes her term. And I'll add to that question whether Democrats are going to be good with her if the Democrats take the Senate, with her at the head of the Judiciary Committee, if they're going to be trying to jam through either a court packing or just try to move nominees through the way that we've seen under the Trump presidency.
Yeah, this one should go to Mary because I'm sure she's much better sourced in this space. But I'm happy to say at the outset, look, I think that this is part of the Democratic Party. We are ruckus. We are never sort of fall in line. We are constantly challenging our own leaders. I mean, some of the biggest grief Barack Obama got as president came from his own party. That's not something we generally see on the other side. Again, even as extreme as and anomalous as this president has been, Republicans largely are in line. They very rarely object to anything Donald Trump has done. President Obama, on the other hand, was largely in the mainstream, and yet Democrats constantly chirping at him. So this is part of the sort of the natural, healthy part of the Democratic Party. And so I saw a clip earlier. Mary might correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Chuck said, "I've talked to Diane," and that's all I'm going to say at this point, or something very Chuck Schumer. So that'll be, you know, again, if Democrats take the Senate and we have to have a debate about who's going to be head of the Judiciary Committee, that's a really good problem to have.
Yeah, I don't think I have a clear set answer on this one. But yes, that is a very Chuck Schumer kind of quote, wink, wink, nod, nod. The hug, lots of drama around the hug, you know, and she is facing a lot of pressure from within, you know, some voices on the left to retire, that it's time for her to move on. I don't know if we're going to see that necessarily, but I think that you will only see that pressure grow from some if Democrats take the Senate for certain. And I wouldn't be surprised if some other committees get shaken up as well.
All right. I am going to now take a question from Adam Abadir. He says the First Amendment protects freedom of the press, but surely in these times of infotainment and misinformation, not everything put out there is press. Does it require government intervention? Are we doomed to our own full respective fact bubbles? And how can democracy survive in that scenario? I'm going to add also to that question, a topic we didn't get to in the beginning, if anyone wants to add on to this idea of what is press today? Is that Twitter? Is that Facebook? What sort of responsibilities do they have? Essentially, as dispensers of news, a lot of people, that's where they get their news from. So if anyone wants to take on any element of that, about like sort of what is the press today? And how do we hold it to standards?
Well, I think this, you know, gets to the issue of social media and you know, whether there's going to be greater regulation of social media, whether the social media companies, as they have started to do, become much more aggressive in deciding what we can read and what we can't. You know, this is going to be another huge issue going into 2021, regardless of who's president. But you know, and I think we should talk a little about this the Hunter Biden email story, because I think it in many ways just sort of captures all the you know, the tensions about and difficulties in how you approach how social media should be approaching stories like this, and whether the government should be weighing in. You know, this is a story, classic dueling narratives. You know, Fox News, conservative media, the emails are smoking guns. The other side, MSNBC, CNN, and to some extent, you know, the main newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, this is likely Russian disinformation. It should be dismissed. The fact is, we don't know whether these emails are legitimate or not. We don't know whether they are Russian disinformation. And I want to read them, I want to see them, and I want to try and report them out to the extent that I can. And I think what Twitter in particular did in blocking those New York Post accounts, or people retweeting the New York Post story, did enormous damage to Twitter, and it almost, you know, increases the pressure for some to say, wait, we can't have them making those sorts of decisions for us. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, I just throw that out there because I think this is a classic, really difficult issue. And I think the Hunter Biden story sort of encapsulates so much of what's difficult about it.
Yeah. Okay.
Anybody else wants to weigh in?
Does anyone else have some thoughts?
No, I'll try and quickly. I mean, a related issue is, I mean, and this gets to the broader issue of the power of big tech in this country. And you've got Amazon, Google, Twitter, and Facebook. I mean, all those have been in the proverbial crossfire. Just today, the Justice Department sued Google for antitrust violations, and there's an area where there has been some bipartisan agreements on that something should be done. I mean, there are obviously differences in terms of what the approach would be, but there's an area where, come next year, you might see some bipartisan consensus of a way to tame the tech giants, and that'll be something interesting to watch.
Yes, absolutely. I will add that one of our questioners also brought up the Hunter Biden story, although with a slightly different angle, said essentially, how does this compare to the avalanche of coverage about Hillary Clinton's emails in 2016? And does this feel like a positive and deliberate change on the part of news organizations? I mean, I'll just add one thought about that, which is that I think that there weren't a lot of doubts that the emails, for instance, the Podesta emails, were legitimate, that they were real. So we didn't have that element of it at play. So this time, but does anybody think that this is a correction on the part of the media that thinks that they overdid the emails thing last time?
I will say, I think the media, has become aware. I think Giuliani's role in all of this raises red flags, I think, for a lot of folks in terms of being aware of what's a shiny object put out there by a campaign for some political purposes 2.5 weeks before an election. That doesn't make, to Michael's point about trying to get seeing the email, seeing what's really there. It still needs, I think, a more thorough vetting, but I think the media has become, I think, a bit more aware of some of the political maneuvering around these things and being careful in how those are couched, I will say.
I agree with that. I think, Laura, I probably have very different views than everyone on this panel about the 2016 coverage of Secretary Clinton's emails, especially in light of how this administration has dealt with the Presidential Records Act over the last 4 years and what coverage that has generated. I will say, though, I think a lot of Democratic partisans, our issue wasn't with the fact that the Hillary Clinton emails were covered. It was the disproportionality of that coverage, that it felt like on any given day, on any given night, anything you read or watched about Secretary Clinton for the last 6 or 8 months of the campaign was about her emails, that she had no ability to sort of tell any other story. And so I do feel like that was sort of very suffocating at the time. But I'll go back to what Michael said, which is, and I'm very unsympathetic to the plight of social media in how they've handled disinformation or even questionable information. If you go back to Facebook in 2016, I'll even buy their sort of story that they weren't aware of how much they were being used to sort of disseminate bad information. And that they were just sort of naive to it. So even if we accept that, we're 4 years later, in Facebook, Twitter, all of these sort of very prominent, well-sourced, prolific platforms have not figured out what to do, right? They sort of, okay, we'll do this sort of warning. Well, let's make it a different warning, and we'll take the story down. Actually, we'll post it. It is mind-blowing to me that they have not spent the last 4 years knowing that this is coming and getting ready for it.
And just to pick up, what was, to me, most offensive about the way Twitter handled it is, what was its initial explanation? It was that the emails were obtained without authorization, and therefore that was grounds for taking them down. I mean, give me a break. The New York Times obtained Trump's tax returns without authorization, but none of us doubted that they were doing a public service by writing about them. The Pentagon Papers, the Snowden material, lots of important public interest stories come about through material that we get without permission from or authorization from the whoever is authorized to release them. So I think that was, the fact that they couldn't figure out what their grounds were for taking it down was something that leapt out at me.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to another question from Akil Patterson. He says that we live in a world with identity politics, but we still have seen race relations in this nation continue to fall. I'm not sure those two directly relate, but I think we understand what he's getting at. What would you suggest for the next president to do? keeping in mind we may have the same president, it may not be a new president, to increase access to capital for African Americans and to the Latinx community who may be immigrating and now living in this country. So essentially, how can essentially communities of color increase their capital, their political capital, their ability to influence what we see and to improve race relations?
I'd say vote. I think that that the sort of one very reassuring thing we've seen over the last 4 years, again, starting from January 2017 and that Women's March in the third week of January, millions of people took to the streets. I don't think we had seen that all throughout Barack Obama's 8 years in office. That came. We then had sort of unprecedented constituency outreach to save the Affordable Care Act in Congress, right? The switchboards were flooded up. People were going to town halls. People were calling their members of Congress. Then we saw the March for Our Lives for gun safety. People were hitting the streets again. So I think the people are energized and more engaged than they have been in a very long time. Obviously, the protests over the summer was another example, the most recent example of people sort of being active and engaged. And as my boss, President Obama, says, like, that is all very constructive and necessary, but it is equally necessary to vote. And I think that that making sure people understand that the true power and responsibility that comes with being a citizen is at the ballot box is important. And then it's not sort of go home. It is continuing to stay on your elected representatives, continuing to organize on the ground where you are, pressuring your members of Congress, pressuring your state legislature, your school board, your town board, your mayor, for what you believe in. I also think the answer here isn't just, the answer here isn't just government. That if you look at what has happened in the last few months or over the course of this year, you've seen large corporations, large companies in the private sector stand up and take a stance to tackle racial equities or racial inequities. And so I think looking beyond just government as the solution is going to be a big part of the path forward here. So that would be my answer.
I think.
All right, I'm going to wrap us up quickly in a minute. I'll give you all a chance to say a final word. Two things I want to hit quickly from the questioners, lest they think I am ignoring the questions. One is about whether Jeff Bezos, who's the owner of the Washington Post, what kind of influence he has in our coverage. And I'll say, as far as I know, I'm not in charge, but he is actually very hands-off in terms of the editorial content. The other question that somebody posed is essentially suggested that the presenters here have all openly shared their Democratic Party leanings. I would just say on behalf of the panel, well, obviously Eric has some obvious and clear Democratic Party leanings. I think the rest of us are just doing the best we can to give an analytical approach to what's happening. And when the Republican Party is in power, you should expect reporters to be critical and asking hard questions of them, as we all have done with Democratic administrations as well. So I guess I would reject the premise of the question.
I think Eric can probably endorse that. We have been,
yes. I don't think Eric thought we were
not
all
shied away from
pocket.
criticism of previous Democratic administrations.
100%.
Exactly. So anyway, obviously you're free to disagree, but I think I speak for all of us when I see that. It is 5 o'clock or 5:01, and I think we were supposed to end at 5. But does anybody have any last thoughts that they want to offer before we officially say goodbye?
My advice to people is just for the next 2 weeks, fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a really it's going to be in for a really bumpy ride, and even beyond that. And it should be a really interesting and testing time for our democracy.
The only thing I'd say, and at the risk of sounding sappy, and I am very critical of the press, as probably came through in this panel, but I do think as an American, as a citizen, we're all sort of profoundly grateful for journalists right now, that you all are one of the sort of last guardrails we have protecting our democracy. And I think that, you've largely risen to the occasion over the last 4 years. And so, and now in COVID, you're risking your own public health and your own safety to sort of hold government leaders account and keep us educated. So I just think, you know, we can't salute you enough for everything you're doing.
Wow, that seems like an excellent note to end on. Hopefully someone got that down in writing for when things, you know, when things may be different.
Keep that tape. Keep that tape.
Well, yes, exactly. We'll keep that tape. All right. Well, I just, Andrea, I think we'll see us out. I just want to thank WashU and Andrea for having me and having all of us here for what I think was a really interesting conversation.
Absolutely. Well, I just want to thank our moderator, Laura Meckler, and all of our panelists for a most interesting and very insightful discussion here. I think everyone benefited from it. Thank you. And I also want to thank everybody who's participated and watched this event and submitted questions. I think all of those enhance the whole experience. And I finally want to thank everybody for all of your continued support for Washington University. We really appreciate all of your participation, interest, and support. So thank you so much, and I hope everybody has a great evening. Thanks so much.